So good afternoon, or depending on where you're joining from in the world, it's generally quite an international event. Good morning or good evening. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our final seminar of term in this series that we co-host between the Centre for Christianity Worldwide and the Divinity Faculty in Cambridge. I'm sure you're all far more familiar with Zoom than you ever wanted to be in your life, but please keep the audio muted during Anna's presentation. That would be great, just to help cut out background sound. Anna said that her Wi-Fi is occasionally a little bit dodgy, so keep an eye on the chat box, because I may ask you to cut your video if we're having problems with bandwidth, just to help to sort that out. We're planning to record this, the presentation. We won't be recording the Q&A, but if you'd rather not appear in the recording, also feel free to turn your video off. And I think that is all of the housekeeping. So it's my pleasure to introduce Anna. Dr. Anna Rowlands is the Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University. Her research focuses on a whole mix of really fascinating things. So forced migration, Catholic social teaching, and the work of a particular group of 20th century thinkers, Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, and Gillian Rose. And I think she'll be drawing on kind of all of those threads in different ways in this presentation. Her latest book is titled Towards a Politics of Communion, Catholic Social Teaching in Dark Times, and was published by T&T Clark this year? Last year?
Last week.
Last week, very recently.
Yeah.
I'll be speaking today on reading Simone Weil in East London. Her presentation will draw on empirical research conducted with the Jesuit Refugee Service in London. And we'll be bringing this experience of refugees living in destitution into dialogue with the work of Simone Weil. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you for giving up your time, everybody, this afternoon. And yeah, so basically this is a slightly strange paper in a way, because it sort of brings two things together that I've been thinking about, and I was thinking about them separately, and then because of the fieldwork I ended up doing with the Jesuit Refugee Service in London, they ended up being two things I was thinking together. So I first started working on Simone Weil probably 20 years ago, and I'd worked on her in the context of working on the work of Gillian Rose, a 20th century philosopher. And then I had put Weil down and left her alone for a while, and I had picked up my reading of Hannah Arendt again, and I was asked by the Jesuit Refugee Service to go and do a bit of work with them, listening to the experiences of refugees who were living in asylum destitution, so people who were kind of trapped in the system without any way of kind of moving forward with their cases. They had no further right to appeal at that point, and were trying to get the system back moving so that they could access rights. And I had assumed that I would bring Hannah Arendt's work on the politics of membership, who belongs and who doesn't, and how we decide on those things, into dialogue with that experience. But in fact, when I did the interviews, what I found very quickly was that the people who I was speaking to sounded as if they were speaking at times pure Simone Weil. So I went back to Weil's work simply because it echoed so much of what I was hearing directly in the interviews themselves. So this paper is a kind of return to thinking about Hannah Arendt and Simone Weil and Gillian Rose as belonging together, as a kind of neglected canon of 20th century political thinkers, but doing that in dialogue with the voices and the experiences of those I was listening to in East London. So the paper is a kind of sort of formal research paper of me trying to condense that thinking together. So I'll begin formally. And I'm going to begin with a quote from Simone Weil. And I suppose if anything sums up in a sort of in 2 or 3 sentences, the core of what I found myself just meditating on in the 3 years since I did those interviews, it's this quote. The essential contradiction of the human condition, so the essential contradiction of the human condition is that man, it's gender exclusive language from when it's written, is that man is subject to force and craves for justice. So the essential contradiction of our human condition is that we're subject to force and yet we crave for justice. We are subject to necessity and crave for the good. It is not man's body, his body alone, that is thus subject, but all his or her thoughts as well. So it's not only our bodies that express this kind of contradiction of the subjectivity of force and the craving for justice, it's our thoughts as well that express this contradiction. And yet, Weil says, man's very being, humanity's very being, consists in straining towards the good. And it's this contradictory, paradoxical wrestling with the history of force and the straining towards the good that is the site of productive, an important contradiction for me. So Simone Weil wrote these words in perhaps her single most luminous piece of writing, her essay on Homer's Iliad. Weil reads the poem as a narration, a storytelling of the history of force and its interruption by what she calls the reflective interval. Only the reflective interval is capable for her of breaking through into the logic of force. Force, Weil argues, holds all in its power. It can be possessed by no one. It intoxicates its supposed master, so those who think they master force. In fact, it intoxicates, so it possesses them, and it destroys its victims. Yet Weil does not imagine love on the one hand and force on the other as simple opposing binaries, or even as a productive dialectic. Suffering and conflict are not put to use in her thought, but they are part of the configuration of simply what is, and therefore what must be tarried with, what must be wrestled with. Necessity is the arena in which freedom finds itself. So it's in the context of what is real that freedom comes to be important, to matter, to express itself. Weil wants us to learn to dwell as deeply and unsentimentally as possible in the givenness and the limit of the world. She's a thinker of limit, where what is most real is to be found through critical attention to what she calls both gravity, all that weighs us down, and to grace, that which frees us. Weil uses the Iliad to stress that we are obligated to attend to, rather than allow our minds to shrink away from, the history of force and what she calls its invasive misery. This for her is the only route towards love and justice. She writes starkly, quote, "Only he who has measured the dominion of force and knows how not to respect it is capable of love and justice." So only the person who has measured the full dominion of force and knows how not to respect force, having looked it in the face, is capable of love and justice. This exemplifies Weil's distinctive pathway towards what I want to call a negative political theology. In a recent edition of the journal Modern Theology, David Neuheiser introduces a series of essays on negative political theologies. He outlines the following characteristics of such a theology. A negative political theology, he says, challenges any claim to ultimate legitimacy, obedience, or worship on the part of a political structure, a political person, or a collective entity. It sets limits to what any of those things may claim of us. It refuses the temptation to work backwards from messianic expectation to political structure. In its constructive mode, that's its deconstructive mode is what it resists. However, in its constructive mode, it seeks to foster growth in relational intimacy through a pathway that fosters practical solidarity and renounces the pretense of intellectual security. So this is Neuheiser's ambition for what he calls a negative political theology. Negative political theology deploys the tension of meaningful contradiction in precisely the way Weil was trying to get us to think about the meaningful contradiction of force and straining towards the good, to help us live beyond either of the poorer options of either utopian idealism on the one hand, or just alienated critique and pessimism on the other. But what I think is striking is in what could otherwise be considered a very helpful contribution by Neuheiser, he doesn't consider the canon of luminous women social philosophers. So he lists off a whole load of male social philosophers and theologians who can be considered to be helpful, but actually ignores a canon of, I think, luminous women social philosophers who, to my mind, map precisely this pathway towards a political theology, both negative and relational, produced at the anxious interface of the political crises of the last century. This body of women social philosophers Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, and Gillian Rose, are often thought alone, but rarely together. Yet when taken together, they help us to rewrite and reconfigure the boundaries of the theopolitical in ways that exceed the tropes of largely male-authored political theologies or political theories, even critical theories, of the 20th century. Each of these women refuses any easy boundary between the political and the theological, insisting on a response to political crisis that recognises and puts to use the political in theology and the theology in political theory. Each draws freely across theological and philosophical borderlands. They transgress the boundaries we're not meant to cross between the two. They write in profound dialogue with the major thought traditions of the 20th century, but they correspond in pure terms to none of them. Despite profound and important differences between their work, I think they share a fascination with themes of rootedness and uprootedness, and the importance of thinking time and place, temporal place. They provide amongst the most fertile critique of the turn towards both the communitarian on the one hand and rights personalism on the other. Each thinks critically, as Weil expresses it, the tendency, and I think this is a brilliant phrase, I find it really helpful. So each thinks critically, as Weil expresses it, the tendency to immolate ourselves in the collective, to wrap ourselves almost in its comfort to this sort of extreme point. In Weil and Rose, the collective risks becoming both the place of idealization, a new Jerusalem that, in its hope for the pure, cannot see or in time repent of its own violence. However, the collective is also as likely to be the vehicle for the displacement of distress or grief. So we turn to the collective because we want to idealize something in a sort of utopian move, but we also turn towards the collective as a way of displacing ourselves from distress and grief. I mean, I read Brexit partly in that light. Both these tendencies to idealization and displaced grief become forms of political submergence for these three women, leaving us unable to accomplish the political in productive ways. Arendt and Weil in particular are attentive to rights claims and yet fundamentally critical of the frailty and the trans-historical abstraction that they perceive in 20th century rights language. They are each disagreeing thinkers in the severe style who pull our attention beyond the seductive and falsely comforting ethical immediacy of rushing to empathy, rights, the face, the person, or the community. They hold these categories in front of us, but they deny us any easy use of those categories. They won't allow these to be a place of rest or stability or healing or rescue, and yet they see them as vital and important. Each, therefore, in different ways, returns our intellectual and political attention to the concrete, the frail, the risk-taking performance of law in finite and time-bound political communities. To attend to the real is conceived already as an act of resistance to both falsely comforting intellectual abstraction and to the concrete politics that wishes to annihilate or to exclude the full ambition of what it means to be human. To unflinchingly inspect the edifice of the city, to use Gillian Rose's language, as it is to begin the task of imagining an alternative social negotiation of the good. So we begin to open ourselves to a better future by looking bravely and severely at the world as it is. This is, in very rough outline, the amor mundi, the love of the world, read differently in each of the three thinkers, that I think is a space of productive contestation. Now, this afternoon, I'm only going to read Simone Weil as exemplifying such work, but I want to be clear and honest about the kind of intellectual work that's behind my interest in the whole of this territory and why it is that I'm looking at the experience of refugees, partly as that severe willingness to look at the real in order to imagine better futures. So I read her as an overlooked, Weil as an overlooked negative political theologian, and in this instance, I also read her as a refugee displaced writer herself, who can help us think the concrete realities of law, justice, and love, negotiated by a small group of people living in asylum destitution in the East End of London 3 years ago. Reading Weil this way enables both a loyal engagement with her call to attend to the concrete conditions of the world and extends attention to refugee writing and interpretation across the last century by reading Weil as a refugee writer herself. but it also allows critical investigation of some of Weil's own ideas. I will suggest this afternoon that this enables us to talk about the deadly contradictions of our current politics of membership, whether we're thinking about people in the Channel or people at the Polish border. It will not necessarily allow us to do this in more consoling terms, but I hope in more productive terms. So reading Weil in London. 3 years ago, I was invited to undertake a series of fieldwork interviews by the Jesuit Refugee Service, a Catholic NGO working with destitute, so asylum seekers, people seeking asylum living in destitution in the East End of London. The project supports about 250 people living without resolved immigration status, denied a right to work, and without recourse to public funds, many of whom have also spent time in and out of immigration detention and under threat of either long-term suspended non-status or imminent removal from the UK. The NGO runs a day centre, offers hot food, legal advice, advocacy, prayer groups, basic travel vouchers, toiletries, pastoral accompaniment, and a space to meet and share with others going through the same process. One key feature of the work of the NGO is that they enable refugees to be volunteers involved in the operations and work of the service itself, including peer support. They very deliberately are not seen as passive clients or recipients. The language of client is never used. So they're committed to drawing on and developing skills which are currently frustrated by the refusal of the right to work for those seeking asylum. Mindful of the tendency to view refugees and those seeking asylum either through the lens of matter out of place or just as suffering victims, I wanted to find a different way to structure my fieldwork conversations. So I structured the conversations around the language of the good, exploring the basic goods that those who I was interviewing valued and pursued in contexts of extreme adversity and harm, and exploring with them the structural blocks that exist in the asylum process to the realization of those goods. These conversations became the context for exploring the deliberate state manufacture of asylum destitution. Nobody ends up destitute by accident in the asylum system, and the operations of what I would call the privation of the good in the context of immigration detention. So Augustine obviously is lurking in the background here. In the context of a deliberately hostile system whose practices create an unproductive paradox. So I started off by saying that Weil is interested in productive paradoxes. The asylum system, I think, is precisely an unproductive paradox of both stasis and continued uprootedness, the creation of isolation, but also social dependency, exclusion from a public life of participation, and yet an endlessly publicly determined existence without privacy. A kind of alternative community of survival and gift exchange was being fashioned at JRS. One that resisted these unproductive paradoxes, that resisted the logic of privation. It seemed productive to me to think about this space as the coming into being of what Hannah Arendt would call the interest, the space in between, manifesting something of a form of political belonging and beginning as resistance. In the course of the interviews, 3 key analytical insights were offered to me, and these became the basis of my dialogue with Weil's work. And I'm just going to briefly, in the remainder of the paper, outline these 3 key analytical insights brought into dialogue with Weil. The first very, very oft repeated insight and experience of those I interviewed was a description of the way that the asylum process, living through it, distorts your sense of time and temporality. Now, interestingly for me, I did these interviews before COVID, before the pandemic, and very early in the pandemic, I could hear people talking about their experiences of lockdown in ways that were about the distortion of time, the taking out of the normal markers of temporality by which we exist. And the people who are experts by experience and exactly this distortion of time and temporality are in fact those who've lived through the asylum system. It's just we deliberately produce and manufacture that experience for people. Refugees repeatedly describe the negative impact of the duration, the length of time that a claim takes, of poor case judgments generating long appeals processes, of the enforced idleness created by the prohibition on work and the administrative use of immigration detention without time limit as a tool for border management. What was striking was the description of the impact of these practices as a distortion of healthy perceptions of being persons in time. Interviewees described the simultaneous process of the compression of time and anxiety created by the acute sense of time passing. To quote, waiting, reporting, not working, the manner of treatment, sometimes in charities as well as by the Home Office or lawyers, dehumanizes. It destroys us. Destitution makes us go mad. Without structure, you become susceptible to lots of things: isolation, criminality, addiction, mental and physical illnesses, end of quote. Others used the striking and disturbing image of the physical decomposition to express their experience of living in destitution. Quote, I feel as if I am degrading in time, end of quote. One former detainee speaking to an expert panel describes the extreme distorting effect that detention has on your perceptions of time. They said, quote, in prison, you count your days down, so from your release date down, but in detention, you count your days up because it's indefinite and you don't know when it will end. And that experience is massively psychologically harmful. So my second theme is then taken from the interviews: the diminution of skill and capacity in those seeking asylum creates an accompanying sense of dispossession, of being dispossessed of oneself. For those who had been detained, the experience was marked, so this is people who have spent a period of time in an immigration detention facility, of which probably at least half of those I interviewed had. So for those who had been detained, the experience was marked by a sense of dispossession and loss, a permanent sense of personal diminution. Quote, detention finishes people off. It's a form of mental trauma that takes away skill and capacity. We see this, so that this is a quote from somebody who is now a member of staff working with refugees, but had also previously been detained themselves. So they both have experience of working with others and experience of detention. So detention finishes people off. It's a form of mental trauma that takes away skill and capacity. We see this in people who have been highly skilled before: doctors, dentists, nurses, university teachers, but who can't function in these roles, even when they later achieve status, because they never fully recover from the trauma of detention, end quote. In all my interviews, the trauma of detention was connected quite specifically to the use of force, the absence of a time limit, and the mimicking or parodying of a criminal justice process, but without process, that deliberately conveys the idea of a criminal act or intent that detainees who are being detained for administrative purposes cannot internalize or own as a self-identity. One man told me, quote, the problem is the use of force, which shapes the whole reality. The system tells you in all its actions that you are an identity you cannot accept, end of quote. The theme of love denial was also central to the experience of other detainees. One interviewee, he'd been detained twice, the first time for a year, aged about 19, the second when he was 21, for a period of several months. So one interviewee described the ways in which the micro interactions in detention had profoundly altered his character, producing a feeling of self-alienation and self-loathing. Having previously prided himself on being a gentle character, naturally empathetic, he explained that the system only responded to aggression. To get basic supplies of toiletries, you had to demand to become rude and even aggressive. He talked about trying to get bed sheets and a toothbrush and so forth. He noted the sense of self-loathing he felt at the realization that following the second period of detention, he emerged no longer able to feel a naturally empathetic reaction to the suffering of others, and no longer able to trust the motivations of anybody around him, including previously trusted family. He felt on reflection this was a result of both internalizing the aggression and suspicion the system enacted and expected of him, and a deep inner despair and sense of abandonment that he felt in detention. He described the painful process of trying to retrain himself in empathetic instincts a year on from his release. Similar descriptions about the long-term diminution in skill and capacity were repeated by those living with destitution, rather than just those who'd been detained. So it's echoed between the two experiences. Repeatedly, I was told that the system seems deliberately geared to manufacture hopelessness, so to create the conditions for hopelessness in the human spirit. On the one hand, this hopelessness relates to the stasis of the system and its non-responsiveness. On the other hand, it relates to what a number of interviewees describe as the disciplinary structure of the system. One interviewee described the way that the system feels like it quite deliberately aims to foster a self-identity in the asylum claimant that is the opposite of those that enabled their survival and their flight. Quote, "Fleeing takes enterprise, courage, determination, judgment. We see ourselves as having these characteristics, but the system creates a sense of ourselves as the opposite of these things, i.e. dependent, useless, etc." And then he continued, "The system makes us in its own image." End of quote. This gap between the enterprise of flight and the enforced dependence of the system creates an acute sense of affliction and disconnection from self-identity. Interviewees describe the ways that the system increases rather than limits the sense of dependence on other people or the awareness that one is vulnerable and a drain on other people. With some anger, one interviewee argued, quote, "They want to shape the image and shape of asylum seekers. You want to make as in pointing it at me as a representative of British society, you want to make a particular kind of community with asylum seekers shaped in that image. The limits you place on us, on pursuing what's important to us, to being human, are about seeking to destroy something." She continued, "The system shapes your life in such a way that it means you live with no love, no life. Relationships require stability. The system ensures I have no stability." End of quote. One interviewee expressed his sense of the deliberate frustration of hope as follows, quote, "A capitalist system values the idea of contribution. You need to contribute to get something out. When you're not contributing in the way society understands contribution, you don't feel like a member of society. This is deliberate. They, the Home Office, know what they're doing. This isn't just a form of social death, but also intellectually you suffer and die because you can't engage, participate, or contribute. People don't take this into account when thinking about destitution and what the asylum system sets out to do, but it's crucial to understand." This is someone who has a background, has a degree in English, had taught previously in their home country. It's highly, highly articulate. The third analytical point that I want to draw out that was a repeated theme of the interviews is then this. Resistance comes through finding and creating spaces of appearance in which nurturing promise, nurturing care, and contribution are vital. So how do you resist the first two themes? Each interviewee talked about the ways that they had found to recreate the privacy, publicness, and these are not opposite things because people in the asylum system describe the ways in which they're denied both privacy, places to be private, which we take for granted, but they're also denied public spaces as well. So those are not contradictions. So each interviewee talked about the ways that they had found to recreate the privacy on the one hand, the publicness on the other, spaces for participation, temporary rootedness, and community denied to them by the system. Crucially, the worlds that they had recreated, as in exist naturally for so many of us, are destroyed and then actively have to be recreated by those claiming asylum. So crucially, the worlds that they had recreated had emerged from connections of care and hospitality given and received. So just as important that they have a capacity to be people who give as much as to receive. Several detainees had saved the lives of fellow suicidal detainees. Others had volunteered and had secured some sense of well-being through being able to find contributing roles, secular and religious. I asked no direct questions about religiosity, partly because I didn't want that to be seen as prejudicial in any way. However, all but one interviewee talked about the importance of religious practices and traditions to their resilience and survival. The same single scripture passage, Jeremiah 29, was quoted to me several times, quote from one individual, but echoed by many others, drawing from Jeremiah 29. God says, "There are plans I have for you, plans for your welfare and not for your harm." He says, "The plan I have for you is for unexpected ends," end of quote. That was the title I gave to the report that I wrote for JRS. Another told me that in a context of a radical denial of love in detention, he had discovered through its deprivation an external level that he had, he'd been detained and he felt that he'd discovered a kind of radical denial of love in that context of detention at a sort of external level, but in that context had discovered within himself a radical love come through engagement with the scriptures, and that this had given him a defiant sense of hope. Others talked about a sense of deep learning in adversity and care that they viewed as a preparation for something mysterious that lay ahead of them in their futures, that there was a promise that would manifest itself as a gift that they could give to another person at a later point. Reflecting on the insights of my interviewees, I found the resonances with Simone Weil's canon of writing striking. The description of the erosion of the self, the pulverizing of the mind, body, and soul through destitution and detention corresponds so strongly to Weil's description of affliction. Weil makes this distinction between suffering and affliction, where affliction is the kind of most extreme end of suffering. Affliction, Weil argues, is, quote, not a psychological state. It is a pulverization of the soul by the mechanical brutality of circumstances, end of quote. She notes, again a quote, there is no real affliction unless the event which has gripped and uprooted a life attacks it directly or indirectly in all its parts, social, psychological, and physical, end of quote. She locates the reason for this fragmentation in the privation of the good enacted, which separates basic human needs from their satisfaction. It is not simply brutality, the impact of the blow, but rather the gradual erosion of, quote, the ability to make decisions, to possess one's own time and one's body, to plan the future, end of quote, that divorce thought from the thinker. Under two further headings, I want to sketch briefly the connections that I sensed emerging between the worldviews of my interviewees and Simone Weil's theopolitical categories. The first returns us to the quote at the beginning, understanding force as a social relation. I outlined at the beginning of the paper the ways that Weil, writing on the Iliad, imagines force as a perennial social relation and subject of analysis. In her later writing on roots, Weil returns to these themes, but now in the context of uprootedness, forging a connection between processes of derealization and force. She argues that uprootedness depends on the denial of the real. So we can only uproot human beings when we deny what is real, either to ourselves or forcibly to others. Social processes that deprive human persons of a notion of reality uproot. In his comparison of Weil and Arendt, Roberto Esposito notes a similar analysis of social processes of human annihilation in both authors. He argues that Weil and Arendt both theorize force as connected in a primary way to the processes of derealization of that which exists, a process, and this is to quote him, in conjunction with the ideological construction of a world that is so false that the real appears to be unbelievable. I have to say, in a week where we're talking about parties that may or may not have existed, I'm quite taken with the real that appears to be unbelievable, etc. My interviewees described both the methods of extracting and cultivating acceptable refugee stories and the use of criminal processes to manage non-criminal justice processes, as experienced in the case of immigration detention, as well as the social messaging of hostile environment policies to the general population as such a process of forced derealization. Forced territorial expulsion and the wrong return of refugees, so for example, turning boats around in the Channel, are the limit cases of such derealization of that which exists. Weil and Arendt write of the managerial state in its mid-century forms in ways that feel to me deeply resonant with the management of refugee populations now. In her writings on human personality, Weil turns to a third theme that extends her analysis of force. She argues for the inherent impersonal connection that the human mind forges between the good and the sacred. She argues what is universally sacred for the human being is the expectation that good will be done to us and not harm. which makes the destruction of hope in a person an offence against the sacred. Quote, "The good is the only source of the sacred. There is nothing sacred except the good and what pertains to it." End of quote. The eruption, the breaking through of dereliction and anger in the human being at harm and its angry cry, why, is because the sacred roots our expectation of something different, of our welfare and not our harm. For this is a cry of the universal from the grounds of the particular. It is this impersonal cry that roots our obligation to respond. In turn, she argues that freedom of public expression needs to be thought of in terms of an education in public life that enables, quote, "an attentive silence in which this faint and inept cry can make itself heard." And finally, institutions are needed of a sort which will, so far as possible, put power into the hands of those who are able and anxious to hear that faint cry and understand it. How far our public institutions are perhaps from that. This account found profound echo to my mind in the response of refugee interviewees to the knowledge that the system aimed not at narrow justice, but at the destruction of hope as the grounds for deterrence of further and future refugee claims. My second and final theme that connects Weil to the interviewee narratives. So the first was about force as a social relation. The second is what Weil calls decreation, and this takes a little bit of explaining, so bear with me. So decreation is a counterintuitively helpful language, but with some caveats. That's what I want to claim now. So in her notebook, Simone Weil distinguishes between what she calls destruction and decreation, and she thinks it's really important that we understand how coming into contact with harmful experiences can lead to destruction or decreation, or both. But she wants to distinguish these two ideas. She writes that destruction is to make the created pass into nothingness. So to destroy something is to take something created and for it to pass into nothingness. That's an abomination of God's intention. Decreation, on the other hand, decreation is for the created thing to pass into the life of the uncreated. So decreation is for created being to pass somehow into the life of God, into the life of the uncreated, into the divine. As Lindsay Stonebridge notes, for Simone Weil, decreation means to disappear into the world, to surrender to its contradictions, its sufferings, and its mysteries as part of a divine path, to know with the rightless, the superfluous, and the labouring as a condition for any talk of love and justice. For this reason, because it involves this pathway, decreation is always both a political and a mystical process. It is political because both affliction is, because affliction is socially produced, but also because it is a political and contestable claim in itself to imagine that surrendering to contradiction and connecting necessity with freedom in the way that Weil does is a path to the good. That's a highly controversial statement. It is mystical in its receptive format to the life of the divine. My interviewees talk readily of a process of both the destruction of the self, the annihilation of the person, and also of what I think, with some caution around its use, might be termed the decreation of the self. I use the decreation of the self here in ways that echo Weil to name a process by which the person explores an ethics of mutual attentiveness, and which comes about through an interaction with the dreadful history of force facing it full on. Force is not put to use per se, so it's really important that what she's not doing is putting force to use, i.e. we need force in order to be good, or we need force in order to know God, because that would be a hideous claim. So force is not being put to use per se, but it is encountered as part of the givenness of the world and wrestled as part of an apprehension of the conditions of love and justice. So love and justice is not a space of flight away from the givenness of force in the world. However, to use Weil's terminology, especially in the context of the experience of refugees, without any reference to its ethically problematic dimensions of her rendering and use of it would in turn be problematic. So we need to treat it with gloves on, and this is why. Stonebridge writes of the morally distasteful image of Simone Weil sitting on a stool in the refugee camp in France during her own displacement, and writing about giving herself up to the refugee experience as an abandonment that would finally bring her into a decreation, which is, she wrote, the cross. She wrote, quote, "And my greatest desire is to lose not only all will, but all personal being," end of quote. As Stonebridge writes, quote, "Wishing for your own non-sovereignty, for your own non-being, as a refugee, came perilously close to saving the Nazis the bother," end of quote. There is a kind of self-abnegation in Weil's rendering of the non-sovereignty of the self in decreation that is disturbing to anyone working with displaced persons or on refugee ethics. In this context, it is especially striking to me that the narratives offered by those I interviewed provided illustration of the move into forms of decreated non-sovereign ethics precisely without reproducing the self-abnegation that sometimes haunts Weil's writing. To make a case for the careful, with gloves on, use of decreation requires that we return for a moment to the connections Weil weaves between decreation and affliction, the extreme end of suffering. In considering affliction amongst workers in a Renault factory, Weil lays great emphasis on the muteness of suffering workers. She reports that workers tended to talk of their experiences either in cliché or in theory absorbed piecemeal from commentators who ironically lacked the workers' direct experience. To break this cycle of banality and give voice to the afflicted, Weil interposes the necessary mediatory force of the intellectual, who is capable of paying unsentimental attention to affliction. Now, I want to say very clearly, this dynamic was not paralleled in my own experience of interviewing. I was not the necessary intellectual mediator of refugee experience. Whilst the parallels with the description of affliction are notable, suffering does not necessarily make you instantly articulate. My interviewees were not in the least mute and did not speak of their experience in cliched or banal terms. They spoke with startling clarity, sharpness, and depth about their experience. And with the demands of doing so in a second language most often, or more than a second language. It was not clear that intellectual mediation of any kind was needed, and so I'm not making any case of that kind for those who are familiar with Weil. So attending to the crystal clarity rather than the muteness of what was said to me repeatedly about the afflicting impact of destitution and detention moved me in the direction of attending to precisely what was being said about the good and the beautiful in this speech. A language for both of these was frequently found in the texts of religious traditions, both Christian and Islamic, for those I interviewed. If we wish to interpret this kind of speech as akin to decreation, created life passing into and touching on the life of the uncreated, of God, even and especially in the context of reflection, but without giving in to the worrying self-abnegating tendencies in Weil's thought, then we probably need to turn to the very things that Weil herself found most difficult. First of all, the role of community, and secondly, the role of the collective in enabling communal speech and action, community spaces and communal action being the new political spaces refugees, in my experience, were busy forging. So my interviewees spoke directly of the impossible. Using this very language, they spoke of finding new spaces of appearance, speech, and action, facilitated in part by communal spaces, communal texts, and communal traditions. So these were not the achievements of lone individuals alone, but it was about the communal resources that enabled a form of speech and action, a new beginning. None of these spaces, however, were separate, pure spaces away from the history of force. None redeemed the force that caused the affliction. All of these spaces involved the constituting agency of fellow refugees. These are refugees alongside other refugees giving birth to these spaces. Most notably, none of their narratives suggested self-abnegation or a desire to disappear. On the contrary, it's about kind of rerouting this sense of welfare as the root of being human and an experience of the sacred. This expectation, as Weil has argued, is that the good and not harm will be done. The echo with the choice of the Jeremiah passage was, to my mind, striking. There is a plan for my welfare and not for my harm, repeated like a mantra. The expecting, the losing, and the decreating are interwoven in the interview narratives, and in turn, the expecting and the decreating involve the creation of new and resistant spaces of appearance, of welfare, and of participation. And so, in my mind, the long arc back from Arendt, with whom I had begun the interviews, in the communal spaces where refugees were beginning again in the middle of things, here Arendt and Weil and those I interviewed seemed to speak to each other. Arendt speaks of natality, of the fact always of the possibility of new birth, and of the space of the res publica, the public space, as the space in which we come to appear to each other. It's not necessarily about institutions. The public space comes about when we create spaces in which we are seen and heard and can recognize each other and can act anew. For Arendt, the speech and action that enable us to appear and be seen and heard by non-kin others are conceived as political acts, and they constitute, instantiate, and generate the truly public. Arendt writes in The Human Condition, to quote her, "For us, appearance, something that is being seen and heard by others as well as by ourselves, constitutes reality." So that the process of speaking and hearing and recognizing each other brings us back to reality. It constitutes reality. The presence of others who see what we see and hear what we hear assures us of the reality of the world and ourselves. End of quote. An account of re-realization and decreation, of the non-sovereign ethical that takes into account the public history of force, that's sensitive to the multiple ways of refugee appearance, that reinstantiates another public, seems to me to be helpful. In this regard, Arendt offers to Weil a necessary, non-abnegating account of appearance in public. So Weil is a bit too keen to disappear, and Arendt restates herself, also a refugee writer, the necessity of coming to appear to each other in public collective forms, of forging communities of appearance. Nonetheless, Arendt is hostile to the notion that religion is capable of imagining a truly public act or realm. And so, in a sense, what Weil offers back to Arendt is the need for the language of decreation, a language that exceeds the political. And Weil and those I interviewed, especially in their draw to Jeremiah 29, put back on the table the need to think not just of a new public realm to enable refugees a sense of political belonging, but a need to recognize a transcendent realm in which the self is re-received into its divine and human sociality, in which we restore the loss to promise for those who are held in the process. And I'll stop there.